So, hello everyone, and welcome to the channel. Today I have the pleasure of talking with Samuel Klumpenhouwer, who is a medievalist, theologian, and a teacher. He has recently published a book called the Glossa Ordinaria. This is a textbook commentary on Genesis. It was originally published in the Middle Ages in Latin, and so he's gone through and translated that and reproduced it faithfully for us. I will link to his website where you can find more information about his other works and the book itself. And so in today's talk, we focus on the medieval worldview and how it relates to the modern worldview and our faith. I hope you find it interesting, and thanks for watching.
So I grew up in Canada as a Protestant. I grew up in a Pentecostal church, and had a great upbringing. Large family on a farm. Had 12 siblings. Growing up on a family farm in Ontario, Canada.
Right, 12 siblings. Okay.
Yeah, wow. It was beautiful.
Yeah.
It was beautiful.
Yeah.
I started a bit late to get 12. I would love 12, but I started much later than my father.
Okay,
we just have one. We just have one daughter right now.
Okay. Nice.
And then I went to Protestant Bible College for a couple of years studying philosophy, theology, and then ended up after that at the University of Toronto. And I had a couple of Protestant friends who were thinking of becoming Catholic. And then when I was in Toronto, I was exposed to the church more. I was living in a dorm, 20 paces from a church. It was University of St. Michael's College, which is the kind of Catholic college as part of the University of Toronto. Yeah. And so I started going to Mass, just sitting in the back and seeing what was going on and reading a lot. I didn't have many Catholic friends. I didn't really make Catholic friends till after I became Catholic, but
all right.
It was when I was 24 that I went through RCA. At that point in time, it became Catholic. And it was also at that same time I was going through a history degree in Toronto, and I started focusing on medieval studies. I had a couple of wonderful professors there. Yeah. And I ended up remaining in Toronto for my graduate work. So I also did an MA in medieval studies and then a PhD in medieval studies, all at the University of Toronto. Okay. After I graduated, I took a job not in a university, but in a classical school teaching children, and that's where I've been ever since the last 6 years. And then in my free time, I publish studies and translations of various medieval works. Yeah. I have a website, samuelklumpenhouwer.com, and they're all up there.
Yes, I've seen it. Yeah.
And so the main work I spend my time with is called the Glossa Ordinaria, which was the standard Bible commentary, if you will, of the Middle Ages, which has never been translated, or very little of it, I should say. And so I just published the portion on Genesis, and hopefully the publisher will let me keep going and we'll get the whole thing done. But that's a 10-15 year project to get the whole thing done. But that's sort of where I spend my little time. And so I live here. I married a few years ago, 2020, a Southern girl down here, and we have one daughter, Mary Snow, and hoping for 10 more. So
yeah. Nice. Yeah, no, awesome. Yeah, definitely we'll get into the glossa, and I mean, one of my hobbies is also calligraphy. So from that angle,
great. Yeah.
Sort of my connection, independent of sort of, well, when you go into the Middle Ages and you are into calligraphy, inadvertently you end up with the Bible and biblical texts, and so
yeah, I was never a good calligraphist. I studied it on the opposite side of things, paleography, just as part of kind of the standard courses in my degree. But man, that's beautiful to actually do it yourself.
But I guess I mean, some of the scripts you really need to know how to read them. We all, some they push some of those shapes so far, especially when they get a little bit creative with it, that if you don't know, like that's meant to be a S or a A, it's very difficult to read. So
yeah, and then all the abbreviations. It's like you think you learn Latin, and then they have this whole system of abbreviations that you're lost if you don't know all of that.
Yeah. So anyway, I watched some of your videos, and I mean they were very interesting. I guess we all kind of go through some phases and development in our spiritual life, right? So for me, in the first few years, it's been obviously about getting to know the faith and just the rich tradition and the history, and then I think we have these sort of core beliefs professions of our faith. You know, you can look at the even like devotions which kind of surround it, and you have the liturgy, sacraments. I mean, all of that for me forms sort of like what you can call like the Catholic thing, the faith. You know, all these things that we do, we profess, we pray, and in some sense, so as I get deeper into the faith, it's easier to see things like that separate us, or that are different in the wider community or the world, quote unquote. So morals, you know, practices, or these things, I think are easier to sort of differentiate, to see, okay, you know, we have a certain vision, and you hold it because of your faith. But I'm starting to realize that there are things that are even surrounding that it's sort of like the lens we have on, the glasses we have on, that we look out into the world. And at least for me, I realize that my own faith still, I mean, I'm not completely decoupled from the time where I'm born and where I live, you know, so that, and especially converting as an adult, right? So there are certain views that I have that I realize that till now I've still held that view, and I've kind of put the Catholic faith, Christian faith within it. And what I mean more concretely would be something like a materialist, mechanistic kind of worldview. And the danger there is, when I then think, okay, as an example, so like angels and saints, and, you know, you believe in the invisible church, you tend to have kind of like a superhero understanding of it, where it's still a material understanding, but you just transport it and you say, look, now, okay, I believe these things, but the way you experience them, or the way you imagine them, is still rooted in kind of a modern worldview. And, you know, I mean, I might even say most people think that most people, I think, are materialists. It's just so much a part of us that's just how we think, you know, cause and effect is purely mechanical. And so that kind of led me down the path to understand the pre-modern worldview. And I'll kind of lump all of that together. And then, I mean, this is maybe where we can start. So I think today people would be almost proud to say that, okay, we don't think like people used to think anymore, you know, superstitious, unscientific, blah, 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 right? But is it so that the people in the Middle Ages, they saw themselves rather, did they see themselves as innovative in that sense, or did they see themselves as a culmination of, so let's say, you know, of what came before, and the traditions that came from the church fathers, and I mean, just maybe not, it's kind of hard to say just from a biblical point of view, but or Christian point of view, but just in general, like, was there a break?
I mean, certainly they would take it as an insult to be called innovative. That was certainly not the goal. Now, so even now, maybe they were, maybe they weren't, but that was certainly not the goal. And they wanted to be in continuity with the church fathers, and scholasticism, and the kind of method of pursuing the truth in the universities is very much based on, you know, investigating the authorities. You know, this is when you read Thomas Aquinas, you know, he'll give some authorities that say one thing, and then other authorities that seem in conflict, and he'll try to bring it a resolution. But at the end of the day, it's all about authorities, and so they're trying to be in continuity with that. That said, it's not, I mean, they knew the world, they knew history existed for a reason, that there was a reason that the second coming had not yet happened. And so it's not that everything was meant to remain static. I mean, there was a purpose that history continued, and I think they knew this, and that so that there was a space there for innovation, you know, and in that sense. There's the famous line, I don't even know who started, but that the medievals would say about being dwarves on the shoulders of giants. This is kind of how they thought of themselves, is that the people who came before us were so much greater than us, these giants of old, and we're just dwarves in comparison with them. But that image is humble in that sense, you know, they're dwarves compared to these giants, but the image is also audacious, because they're also claiming to be on the shoulders of these giants, which means that they
So they're a
can
little
see
bit
further.
yeah,
They
yeah.
can see a little bit further than the giants did. And
Yeah.
so they did have that sense. So they weren't trying to go for a static worldview. And, to your point about materialism, materialism is a Christian heresy in a way. There's a reason it comes out of the church. And so there is, is part of this story, is kind of part of the truth gone wrong, because of course we're in material bodies, and these material bodies are something good. And also, the mind works in images, when we can't think of an angel without, of course, we know philosophically, of course, as they would all say, angels have no bodies. But when it comes time to actually talk about them and depict them, you have to turn to the material and come up with some image. And so that there's a sense of materialism. There's a place for that. Of course, the problem is when it gets divorced from the spiritual, and without recourse to the spiritual. And so there's a place for that. And certainly I think they did a better job than we did in not divorcing the material, and this, the materialism that's professed in the universities, I don't know if would they be shocked by it. People who had studied the ancient Greek philosophers would have kind of known of these kind of ideas. So it wasn't completely beyond their comprehension. But certainly they wouldn't. The fact that it's attractive is kind of thing I'm trying to get at, is that I really can't see it being attractive to them. And I think that's one of the big changes, I guess, nowadays, is that not that these new ideas came, but that they became attractive. Which had never been before. And you can talk about why they're attractive. It kind of gives you permission to do what you will and so on. But and so that's kind of, I'm not a philosopher, and I can't talk about these things with too much depth. But that's kind of one of my approaches, is that it's not, if you want to move people away from that, you kind of got to show the ugliness of it, and the attractiveness of meaning behind every rock and all this. I'm kind of rambling, but yeah.
No, that's so. I read a book. It was actually called Acedia by R.J. Snell, which is
I've heard of this. I've not read it, but I've heard of this.
So on the surface of it, I thought, okay, I want to find out a bit more about sloth, not so often talked about. But ultimately, that book was very interesting, because it was really about this enchanted worldview, teleological worldview, on basically seeing things, on how we've lost that. Basically, we just see nature as like a standing reserve that we can just go in and use and do whatever we want with it, rather than each thing having its own kind of purpose and my
wife understands this better than I do, because I will I don't know, I'll put some sugar in my coffee or something like this, and I'll just grab the nearest thing to stir it, whether that's a knife or a fork or whatever. And my wife will go after me, that's not the purpose of a knife. That's the purpose of a spoon. There's a purpose to these things. And I just I'm flippant with the purpose of things.
It becomes much more functional, right? It's just, it's not, it's what it can do for me, rather than what it's made for. Definitely. We can see that scale up, and how that causes problems, when you no longer even consider your body as having its own purpose, where you say it's just what I think it should be. So I think these things, not saying that using a knife instead of a spoon is it's a tiny version of that.
I should go to confession for this.
So
acts against nature.
Exactly. No, but that's very interesting. I think I also been reading, if you've heard of this novel called Laurus by
yes, I've read it a couple times. Okay,
that was a big it's been quite interesting for me, because that kind of fits into this whole thing, because I was also looking like there's one thing to read about these things, And I think, but it's to try to recover it, maybe even try to understand it. You need to have narrative stories, and you need to. So I think Laurus is good, and also Name of the Rose, Umberto Eco. Although that doesn't go into so much.
It's been too long for me. It's been too long since I read it. I don't
Yeah,
remember
yeah.
as much about that one, but
Yeah. But one thing
yeah.
that struck me was just this understanding that it's that cause and effect is linked with sin and grace, in the sense that, you know, if something befalls me, it's because you know, I sinned, or something befalls the community, it's because somebody in the community is sinning. Or even if there's an act of God, there's a, well, act of God without quotes, I guess.
Yeah.
Then that's because of, yeah, we've done something wrong. We didn't worship the right way, or somebody is sinning. I mean, in Laurus, I think there are some examples where it actually makes sense, also in a very mechanical cause way, where I can say, look, I drink too much, my life falls apart. That's the consequence of my sin. But in that case, both are aligned, you know, pretty much together. Like God is judging you for the sin. But there are some examples, for example, in Laurus, I don't know if you remember, but I think they have like some drought or cold spell. And then there's a woman who's pregnant, but they don't know who the father is. So there's some adultery going on. And then they say, okay, we have to, I don't know, banish her, or I don't know, do something. So in that case, the mechanical causality is not really, is not there, right? You can't say that those are mechanically linked. And so, yeah, I wonder what just your thoughts on this are, like.
Yeah. Well, what comes to mind, and we're getting a little bit into some of the differences, I think, between the East and the West, between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, not so much in the theological sense, but in the West's favor of law and reason that you don't have to the same degree in the East. Like, so for instance, there's in the Catholic Church, we have a code of canon law, you know, and a system very laid out of church courts and all this kind of stuff, which you don't have to the same degree, at least in the East. That kind of organization and legal system is just not to their liking, or I don't know how to explain it, but and in the middle, a lot of this kind of came to a head in the 1000s, 1100s, 1200s, where you had a number of ways of resolving disputes that kind of made these appeals to something higher than what we normally see as cause and effect. So, for instance, you had, you know, a trial by ordeal. Okay, so you had, you know, a suspicion of someone committed a crime or adultery or something, and then, you know, you're going to expose them to some kind of ordeal, you know, a burning or so on. And depending on how the wound healed, that would be taken as a sign of guilt or innocence. These kind of trial by ordeals that the Middle Ages often mocked for. And the church, though, it put a heavy hand on these practices. And they were banned repeatedly at church councils, especially at the Fourth Lateran Council, and they were abandoned in favor of reason, of law, of a legal system. So these kind of things now have to be tried before a court, and there's investigations with lawyers and all this kind of stuff. And, you know, I can kind of understand the old way of doing things. You know, you're just going to appeal directly to God. Why do I have to spend, you know, months in court going through this whole process when I can just make an appeal directly to God for him to reveal, you know, the guilt or non-guilt of this or that thing. But at least in the West, the church very much it was suspicious of this, because it seemed like it was tempting God, and that it wasn't using his gifts properly, that the normal God might reveal his will in that way. You know, God might reveal, you know, certainly events might be in retribution for the sins of a nation. It's not like they're saying that those things didn't happen, but in the normal course of things, it was through our reason that we were to use, and we couldn't kind of force God's hand to talk in the way that we wanted him to talk in that sense.
You mean to to ascertain, for example, after the fact, guilt or something. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, to force God to speak in
Yeah.
the manner
Yeah.
of healing a wound in this or
Hmm.
that way, when really we should be using what God has given us, namely our reason. And this is, certainly in the Middle Ages, this kind of love of law, and you can kind of understand. Nowadays we don't like the law very much, but in a way that's because we have too much of it. I mean, our
Yeah. True.
society is so heavily
Yeah.
regulated
Hmm.
that just traffic laws. I mean, the intricacies of these
Yeah.
things.
Sure.
And when we sort of have this opinion of, I think, a right desire that this is too much.
Hmm.
But in their society it was the opposite, right? I mean, it was chaos. Much of society was chaos, and so there was a true love of
Sure.
law, that
Hmm.
we just don't understand anymore. And so these kind of changes were embraced in many ways, not
Yeah.
immediately by any means. But I mean, back to your point, though, all that to say, that doesn't mean that they didn't see a connection between, I don't know, calamities and the sin of this or that person. Because
Yeah.
obviously there
Yeah.
must be a connection, because, back to the point about history, I mean,
Mm.
history exists for our sake. And we, it's our telos to become saints. And so there,
Mm.
the reason history is happening is to somehow make us into saints. And so, yeah, all of this must be connected somehow to virtue and vice and all of that.
Yeah. So one thing you can say is, okay, there was a link of, let's say, righteousness or sin with cause and effect. I mean, even for example, COVID. Some people have said, that's a judgment.
Yeah.
But so, yeah, I guess the hard part is if we want to recover this kind of enchanted and mystical worldview, what things do we take and what things do we leave in some sense,
Yeah.
because and that's the hard part, because I think it is kind of dangerous if you go down this path and you just wholesale say, that I'm gonna try to open myself up to all of this. You don't know what you're actually getting into, and also on the one hand, that's I would say your sort of personal your spirituality, how you see the world. On the other hand, what I'm finding is even just trying to adopt that worldview a little bit, when you go and talk to people, you'll come across as being crazy, because
Yeah.
you now live in a world completely different from 90% of people. So
Yeah.
I don't know how you've dealt with this, or you felt that because you've studied it and you sort of live in that world. How do you feel when you talk to somebody who has a modern
Yeah.
worldview?
I'm not too talkative on the one hand.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
that kind of saves me from a lot. The
Yeah.
people I do talk to a lot are my students, but this is the beautiful thing, is that I teach. So I teach children. I teach middle school.
Mhm.
And so, I talk a lot about that kind of worldview with my students, my 12-year-olds or 13-year-olds,
Mhm.
and I make the case for, Dante's view of the world, geocentric, and
Mhm.
the stars, there are angels behind the stars and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And, they're old enough to kind of, it's not right to say I teach it tongue in cheek, because in a way I am truly teaching it, but they can, anyways, they kind of understand the complexity of what I'm trying to do, but for them, it's attractive.
Yeah.
In a way that it's not to adults.
Mhm.
Yeah. It's very difficult to say those things to adults. It's just a big joke to them. And it's very hard for me to make it attractive to adults, but to kids, I've had a lot of, and by the way, I don't know if it's specifically, I think it's in part that they're kids, but it might be something about this upcoming generation that they are just more open to these things, that it could be generational as well.
Yeah.
And I'm blessed with a wife that is very on board with, or even more so with, with that kind of stuff. But I mean, to your point of it, how much do you take or not, that I don't have a good answer for, and it's
tricky. Yeah.
I'm just kind of playing around with things, to see the world in that way. But at the same time, I realize that certainly in the medieval church, there are kind of limits. So, I mean, take astrology, for instance. I mean, certainly there's a place for the zodiac, if you will. If you read Dante, it's in there, and there's a place for that, but
Mm.
it's not. There are strict limits on how you can, how far you can take, the influence of the stars on us and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
when
yeah.
it gets into what we would call astrology, but that
Mhm.
wasn't really a bad word for them. Yeah, I don't have a good answer. I'm still just kind of playing around with it, and I'm just kind of throwing spaghetti on the wall and
So,
seeing what sticks there. I don't know.
yeah. No,
We'll
no,
see
definitely. I
see
think
what my students turn into in 10
yeah,
years. I don't know.
exactly. Yeah, I think it is. It's definitely a tricky one. But when you look at things as having their own sort of teleology or part of
Mhm.
God's plan, when you begin to see that okay, there are um, conscious agents, that are bigger than me, that can influence
Mhm.
me, and can influence groups of people, or there's sort of manifestations of when people get together. There are these higher order principles that arise. I think all these things are definitely helpful to understand more of the more mystical aspects of the
Mhm.
faith, which I think maybe because as a reaction to the Reformation, compared to Orthodox, the Catholics we became much more sort of focused on the core, let's say,
Yeah. Yeah.
like
Mhm.
went through sort of iconoclasm again.
Yeah,
Um,
and I think Evelyn Waugh actually talks about this too in one of his, I think his biography. I mean, Campion, that in times of great controversy, when most people are engaged in polemical writing, the kind of subtleties and nuance kind of go off to the side, because
mm,
when you're writing polemical writings, that's just not really the place for nuance.
yeah, yeah.
But there's a loss there, and it might clarify the issues in a way that kind of precision, but there's a kind of a loss of nuance and fullness that is there. I was also thinking, one of the greatest spiritual insights, and it was only really the last year or two that I also realized about, how everything takes on meaning is,
Hmm.
and this was, I think, from Father Ripperger online, priest online I listen to
Yep.
sometimes. He was talking about this, that um, when you're being tempted with something, whatever sin, someone is prone to, it's actually in that very sin or in that very temptation. I mean, that is your path to sanctity. So, I mean, if you're
Hmm.
struggling, if it's lust that you're prone to, I mean, it's through chastity that you become a saint. For someone
Mm,
who doesn't struggle with anger, um, you know, uh, that's not your path to sanctity. And
yeah,
so
yeah.
it
Fair
also
enough.
gives meaning to all these sins, is that,
Hmm.
whatever you've committed, I mean, that's your path to sanctity. And so it gives meaning even to your misdeeds, in a way that, these are not things to just forget about. I mean, this is your path to sanctity.
Yeah, sure.
And so that brought a lot of meaning, especially to me, to kind of integrate, um, to look upon my past with more meaning, that this wasn't, these evil things I've done weren't, I wasn't just supposed to forget them. I mean, no, that this is how I'm going to become a saint, is by fighting against this or that I've struggled with. And so that brought a lot of meaning to my life and to my, it's weird to say meaning to my sins, but that's,
Yeah.
um, anyways, I think you kind of understand what I'm trying to get at. I don't know how to
Sure, sure.
express
No,
it
it's
properly in words, but
yeah,
mhm.
it's beautiful. It reminds me of of course, the risen Christ has his wounds, right? And that's been linked
Mm,
to that as well in some sense. Um and I don't know where I was watching this, but one idea was, if you attain, let's say you make it to the other side, right?
mhm.
You get to heaven, but if if who gets there doesn't have anything of your past, that's there, are you still yourself? So you obviously
Yeah.
you need to have the wounds that it leaves behind, of course, transfigured and transformed.
Mhm.
But again, that speaks to this. That's part of your story, and I think that's really nice to put it that way, because yeah, if you don't struggle with, let's say, gossip, then you can't exactly be virtuous in that by not gossiping,
Yeah.
because it's not a
Yeah.
problem for you to begin with. So
And in a way, it's a kind of, again, I don't have the proper language to talk about these things, but it's not like God caused me to sin in a certain way so that the effect would be that I became a saint in that way. I mean, it's kind of like the cause or the reason is kind of like added after the fact, that Jesus came and did what he did and gave it meaning. And
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. No, awesome. So yeah, I think that's something related to what we were talking about. Just having a look at my notes here. So I think something kind of related to what we were discussing is also the perception of time and how that's sort of different in the modern world, where we kind of have this idea of like a linear progress, that okay,
Right.
simply, and I think tied largely to technological advancement, right? So you look out, you say, look, our planes fly faster now than they did 50 years ago. We are obviously a better society now, or that's some
Yeah.
some kind of leak there. And then you go back even further and you say, oh, look, they used oxen and so to till their fields. So we obviously are much more advanced. And the pre-modern understanding, or at least the kind of cliche, is that that history is cyclic, repeating cycles. And I like the synthesis that in the Christian view, it's more of a spiral. So it's linear at the same time that it's cyclic, because things repeat. And I really like that, because it also speaks to like a typological understanding of history. Which obviously has then impact in how one sees scripture as well. So do you think that is that how time was viewed in the Middle Ages, and is that how it impacted how they viewed scripture as well?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if they would have thought it out. It's certainly not the terms they used. I'm not saying those images are wrong, and I think certainly the spiral is more accurate than the line or the circle. But they didn't have that kind of vocabulary for talking about it, and it. I mean, in general, they were less prone in my readings, at least. Most of my reading is kind of with scripture. They talked less about hermeneutical principles and structures than we do. They just wanted to talk about the nitty-gritty details of this or that story. So they're more practical in that sense. I do think that the progressive line is also a Christian heresy, that's a way of viewing history that is heretical. But by heretical, I mean that it comes out of Christianity. It's not foreign to it. It's just divorced from the fullness of the truth. And certainly, to your point about technological advances, the like the clock as we know it. I mean, in the Middle Ages, when they prayed, the liturgy of the hours, I mean, the day was broken up, yes, into 24 hours, but into 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of night, which means that the length of the hour changed over the course of the year, because it was just always that way. Right. Summer and winter. So it's always 12 and 12. And so the length of those individual hours is changing over the course of the year. And so, even just in that, there's a greater fluidity of, their concept of time than we have, where it's,
that's very interesting. It reminds me of, one of my calligraphy projects, I wanted to do a liturgical calendar. And so I looked at the modern liturgical calendars, where what they'll do is they'll have the months evenly split, and then superimposed on that are the seasons and feast days of the year. So Lent and so forth. And then I looked at some of the older ones, and what I found very interesting was they would make Easter, Holy Week, and Lent took up much bigger space, because they're obviously much more important.
Oh yeah,
so,
okay.
Yeah, it was very interesting. So my kind of realization was that in the modern time, we fit the church into the division of time, like you're saying, and that's immovable. But on the other hand, you say, no, what's more important is the significance of Easter, of Christmas. And so they take up visually like this big chunk of the time. And then, quote unquote, ordinary time is takes a much smaller piece. So that was just a small kind of
Hmm.
yeah, interesting
Yeah,
tidbit.
that's beautiful. Yeah,
Yeah,
and you can see that, I mean, in books too. I mean, and it's kind of natural, if you write a history book, you're obviously not going to give or say a family history book or biography or something. You're not going to give equal time to every year of your life. There are obviously
yeah.
years or periods of your life that are more important than others, and then you're going to spend more pages. You're not going to,
Mhm.
give exactly 3 pages to every year and all this kind
Yeah,
of stuff. So,
and
when you actually get down to it, I mean, it's an ugly way of doing history,
mhm.
where you're so dependent upon the clock and
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, the clock especially, I mean, an accurate clock as we think of it now, where every day is 24 hours and every hour is exactly the same amount of time
Mhm.
as we think of it. I mean, to live that way is I don't know, I mean, this is always the struggle with in marriage, because both of you have different concepts of time. I'm
Sure.
Dutch, so I'm
Yeah.
kind of prone to I'm married to the clock, and I
Yeah.
live by the minutes and all this kind of stuff.
Mhm.
And my wife is saying, no, there are different ways of doing these things.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, I mean, Christ is the center of time, certainly in the fullness of time, and that's when they talk about Christ coming in the fullness of time, I don't.
Yeah.
There's a mystery there, and I don't really know what to say about that. But I
Mhm.
often think about that mystery. Um, but certainly there was this notion of spirals too. Like, I mean, they love to superimpose different events on the same day. So, for instance, I was
Yeah.
doing some
Mhm.
work with Genesis, and they'll ask questions, on what day of the year was the world created.
Mhm.
So there's some controversy, and in what season it was, and all this kind of stuff. And
Yeah.
but one of the popular answers was that it was fitting that it was in spring. I mean,
Mhm.
when else would you
Yeah.
create things other than in
Uh-huh.
spring?
Yeah.
And March 25th was taken as the date for the
All right.
creation of the world, March
Mhm.
25th. And so, but that day comes up again in the renewal of the world, because that's also the day that Christ is incarnated.
Mhm.
Uh, and that's also the day it was believed that Christ was crucified upon, March
Yes.
25th.
Okay.
And so
Mhm.
you see these,
Mhm.
to the point of the cycles and the spiral. It's kind of spiraling around these repetitions, but getting closer and
Yeah.
closer to the heart of everything.
Mhm. Yeah. So I mean, the typological kind of um, reading of the Bible. I mean, it just opens up so much for you, right?
Yeah, it's
No, it's
beautiful. Yeah.
beautiful, yeah. And then you really see the providence um and the amazing things with the types that the different types you have of an antitype. It's just the nuance that comes out, out of the each individual story. So
Yeah.
um yeah.
And it's not, Henri de Lubac, I mean, his book on medieval exegesis is kind of the go-to
Hmm.
reference for the study of medieval typology. And
Yeah.
and he talks in there about he says vaguely he references, the rules that governed um, medieval typology. And I've been trying to
Hmm.
figure out what are these rules, because it's certainly
Okay.
not. I mean, the criticism of that typology by the Protestants is that it's unhinged, that you can
Hmm.
end up saying whatever you want to,
Yeah.
and you can make any kind of comparison you want to. But once you spend time with it, it's not that way at all. I mean, it's
Hmm.
actually very there's a structure to it, and there are rules they follow, and it's not unhinged. And I've kind of got a handle on a couple of those rules, but I mean, it's a world that I couldn't be that. I
Hmm.
couldn't do that exegesis myself. I'm just kind of looking in and amazed at it all.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And I think so once you begin to have that typological view, like I'm saying, so maybe that
mhm.
informs your view of history, but I think also of your life and of everything you see, really, because I mean those
Yeah,
patterns are so fundamental. That's why they're in the Bible in some sense, and you see them pop up all over the place, and
mhm.
the details may change, but so some of those stories are just they will be with us till
Yeah.
till the end of time. So
Well, and that's the thing, that these are our stories. If we take biblical inspiration seriously, that
mm,
this text was inspired by God, that means that God, who holds all things in his mind together, that means that God had us in mind when he inspired the Bible. And so this is not a foreign book that we're trying to kind of artificially apply to our lives. Is that no, God actually had us in mind inspiring this book. And so this book really is for us, and not in any kind of artificial way. I mean, it's for us. And so, yeah, the patterns we see there are also in our own lives. And even if you can't explain it all, I mean, that's the appeal of the Bible. That's why so many people pick this thing up, and it just resonates with them, even if we can't explain why it resonates. In the details. I mean, it resonates with us because it was written for us.
I think one way to look at the Bible, and you can say it's got some teachings that I can apply in my life, right? But I think having this typological understanding, it really makes it all the more you realize all the more how relevant each of those stories are, like Old Testament, New Testament. So, for example, AI right now in Tower of Babel, it's like it's almost like, okay, we're literally seeing it, happen in front of our eyes, and so I think that's quite amazing. That's part of what I'm trying to do also with some of the videos I make, also with movies. You see a lot of these patterns emerge, and it helps you sort of understand sort of the deeper meaning of what's going on.
And it also, I think, takes the fear out of it all too, that you're not on the brink of a brand new thing, that people have, these patterns have been lived, they're maybe being repeated in a new form, but the pattern is the same, and the same person who took us through the pattern last time will take us through the pattern this time.
So another question that just I remembered. So we talked about how in that in the Middle Ages there was like a culmination, and not let's say a innovation, but also not a stagnation. It was drawing out the best of what was there. So in terms of what came before them, was there a lot of integration of, let's say, non-European, or how did they see people that were outside, like Western Europe, and how was that information or integrated into it, or did we already see by that time a kind of a split East-West that occurred?
There was a certain split early on, not using the terms East-West, but a cultural or linguistic split between the Greeks and the Latins, and of course leading up to the schism between the two. In terms of the wider world outside of Europe, I mean, everything was tied to the biblical stories. So the various nations of Africa or Asia would be tied somehow to the genealogies that you find in Genesis, and so they're all part of the same story. And so there is room in their story for these non-European nations, and even the Europeans themselves. I mean, it's to us, we can talk in those terms, but they didn't. They of course didn't talk about Europeans. I mean, there is many differences between them, and
of course,
and all this tension. But again, the way to tie in the stranger was to turn to the Bible and figure out what son of Noah they descended from. And all of this, and and it's beautiful that they were able to incorporate everyone into that story. So
and celebrate the differences, not just flatten everything and say everybody's exactly the same. There's no difference.
Right, and that's one of the lost virtues that you come across all the time in medieval works, is the virtue of hospitality, of how do you welcome in the stranger. And it's a virtue they took very seriously, and offenses against hospitality were looked upon fiercely, looked down upon fiercely. And that's something we've lost, right? I mean, I kind of know my neighbors, not really, and my wife is better at being I'm kind of a grouch, and I just want to hang it by myself, but my wife is always thankfully pulls me out of that, and we have people over and all this kind of stuff, but the virtue of hospitality and that kind of openness is very important to them, and the monks live this, right? I mean, they take it, if you read the Rule of St. Benedict and the Benedictine monks especially, I mean, it's built into the very structure of a Benedictine monastery. Even so, we have a new monastery here, Clear Creek Abbey, very vibrant monastery, brimming with people, and you can go, and as a man, you can go and have lunch with the monks, and they still practice. The abbot of this huge monastery will come and he'll wash your hands before lunch, and he'll still practice those kind of old forms of hospitality.
That's
and
definitely
all of that.
That's
Yeah.
lost today. Yeah. It reminds me, there's a tradition in my wife's family in Poland. So for Christmas, they'll always leave a plate. You set the table and you leave an extra plate in case somebody shows up. Yeah, so it's a nice kind of tradition there as well.
Yeah, and there's a skill too. I mean, it's not just about whether you're hospitable or not. I mean, there's a whole set of skills for how to make people feel welcome without making them feel like they're a burden, and all these little social customs to kind of help with that. I mean, that's always my problem, is that I try to, maybe now and then I'll try to help someone, but I don't know how to do it without, embarrassing them. But so we've kind of lost those sensitivities and customs to help us with those issues.
Yeah. No, very interesting. So in the glossa, changing gears a little bit. So what's the role of Mary and the saints? Do they show up quite a bit in there, or is it less restricted? Is it more restricted?
Less. Most of my time has been spent in the Old Testament. You might encounter those more in the New Testament. To the point, I called it a Bible commentary a little while ago. It's a bit of a misnomer.
Yeah.
But I don't know any other way to comment. What this book was really originally a textbook for teaching the Bible. So it wasn't meant to be a Bible commentary like we have now, where you go and consult them and you'll get some authoritative interpretation of this or that passage, and you'll get. And so it's like Thomas Aquinas and the Summa. It's often presenting you with two different points of view, but mostly they stick pretty close to the text, and they don't talk about theological issues in general. And so, yes, they will talk about Mary, in passages that deal with her, and they'll talk about Mary a lot in a typological sense.
So it's
Old Testament, but they rarely kind of step away from that and have general discussions about Mary and theology or the nature of angels or something like that. A little bit. But it's not a systematic commentary that is kind of has a checklist of things it wants to cover. It just, it's about what you would, if you took a course in, on Genesis, it's about that amount of information that you'd get from your professor in a semester. And so it's not exhaustive by any means. It's a strange text. I'm still trying to figure out what exactly it's doing.
Yeah. So just as a context, when was it? I mean, I guess things weren't really published back then, but like, when was it prominent? Is it the same time as the Summa?
A little earlier, so about a century earlier. So it's basically the first textbook of the universities, which are coming into existence, the 1100s and 1200s, and it's basically the first textbook of the University of Paris, which would be the Center for Theology. And so it actually predates the university proper. But it's about 100 years before Thomas Aquinas. And I did a word search in Aquinas once, and I think he cites the gloss 4,000 times.
All right. Okay.
He's always talking about the gloss. It had kind of become, it was no longer a textbook that they were using to teach when Aquinas was there. It was now more like a reference book that you would go and read. But certainly, obviously, he was reading it.
It was in his library
all the time. It was in his library, and he knew it very well. And of course, his contemporaries did also. But the main textbook of theology that was actually used in the classroom for in Thomas Aquinas' day was Peter Lombard, the Sentences. That was the textbook that everyone read, and it's a similar kind of thing. It goes through the church fathers. It chooses a topic. I don't know whether angels have bodies or not, and it'll go through the fathers and take some that clearly say yes, some that maybe say no, and then kind of draw a resolution out of things.
Okay.
And so that was the main textbook in Thomas Aquinas's day for theology.
So the gloss was it sort of was superseded by other texts, and it kind of fell out of
use? Yes, yeah. I think that's fair to say. The height of its popularity was in the 12th century, but it was the first of a scholastic method, and because it was the first, it wasn't the best. It wasn't compiled necessarily in the best way. It wasn't the peak of things, and so it was superseded in the same way that Lombard in a way was superseded by Aquinas' Summa, because everyone reads the Summa now and no one reads Lombard, but in that day everyone read Lombard. And so too with the gloss, it eventually kind of superseded. It hung around, if you jump up to Martin Luther, he still knows it quite well and talks about it. But there were other resources that were done more in a more consistent or in a more in-depth way. And so it kind of eventually got superseded. But it has its glory for being the first of these texts.
So as a modern reader, what do you think is the advantage of reading the gloss versus the Summa or something more like you're saying it's been superseded down the line? So is there?
I have no idea. This is why I'm a bad salesman, because I don't know why you should buy this rather than the Summa.
Okay.
Well, of course, it's more focused on is directly on the Bible, and so of course the Summa is more theoretical and systematic. And so it's directly based on the Bible, but it's difficult to read. You can't just pick it up. If there's some samples of the pages on my website, and if you look at some of the pages, with the comments between the lines and all surrounding, and I don't know what do you do with that when you pick it up?
Do you mean the original or your one?
Both. So I try to mimic. I try to mimic the format that you would find in a medieval manuscript, and. But you can't. My point is that you can't just pick it up and read it like a normal book. That's just not how it reads, because again, this was meant originally to be taught in a classroom. So it's kind of like the master's notes as he's teaching and all this kind of stuff. Right. Similar to when I read a book, I'm going to make little comments on the side of things to bring up and all this kind of stuff. I think what it does tell us though is that they read things, the format that they read things. The Bible very slowly. It was not a quick read. They read the Bible very slowly and with a great sense to its grammatical structure and rhetorical devices it was being used. And so it was very grounded, whatever when we talk about spiritual interpretations and typology and all this, but that layer of interpretation is grounded in a very close reading of the letter of Scripture. And Aquinas talks about this himself, is that the spiritual readings are founded in the literal meaning, and you can't have the spiritual meaning without the literal meaning. You need them both. And if you don't, that's when the spiritual meanings kind of can go off the rails, when they're not grounded in the literal.
You mean something like an allegorical reading where you just
well, you first, this is if you take an allegorical meaning, I don't know, like Noah's Ark being a type of the church, saved, washed by the waters of baptism and the flood. If you take a reading like that, you can't just go straight to that reading. You first have to understand the literal or historical or what is the actual story of Noah. You can't. You need to know what's going on in the actual story before you can jump to those deeper levels. So
no, that's very interesting. I don't know how much time you have, but I
can go for 10 minutes. I hear my wife in the background cooking.
All right,
I think she'll be ready pretty soon.
Okay. Just you had another translation or another book on the manual for.
Yes. That's not published yet. I've been trying for years.
Okay.
It's coming. It's in review right now with a publisher, and I think we're nearing things that should be ready soon. That was something I was working on for my dissertation. And yes, so the situation written about the year 1200, 1250.
Okay.
The situation for priests at that period of time is that there were no seminaries. Seminaries as a place to train priests are after the Council of Trent. So in the Middle Ages, you don't have schools dedicated to the training of priests. Now, a lot of the more intelligent priests are going to go to the university and so on and so forth, but not all of them by any means. And so the way you would typically become a priest is through what we might think of as an apprenticeship program. You would go to your parish and you would work yourself up through the orders. You would be a lector and a doorkeeper and a lector and all the minor orders, as they would call them. And then eventually, when you were ready and had kind of proven yourself, you could become a subdeacon and a deacon and a priest and so on and so forth. But there wasn't a seminary that everyone went to. Now, that kind of apprenticeship works well for training priests in the rituals of the church, and how to say mass and use the books and all that kind of stuff. It works well for that. It doesn't work as well for training them in the theology of the church and having a broader idea of God's plan for salvation and all this kind of stuff. And so there were some real problems with a lot of priests that were not too intelligent and maybe not even literate and all this kind of stuff. And so there was a desire somehow to alleviate, to help this situation. And one of the ways is this, a number of aids, books that you could go and learn about confession, how to hear confession, and, the church's laws on confession and the theology of confession. And so that's what this book is. It's a manual for confessors that would help them have a better understanding of the theology and the laws of the church, and also how to hear a confession. So some psychological training about the nature of people and all this kind of stuff. So there were a number of these manuals written, some more popular than others. Mine was not very popular, the one I was working on, by John of Kent. It only survives in a few manuscripts. But in any case, it's just fascinating to see what was going on at that period of time, and what they were all talking about.
Yeah, and in your experience, have the penances changed?
So the big they have and they haven't. So if you jump back a few centuries to the year 800, 700, there's a number of books on penances that you can find, and it's very kind of a one-to-one correspondence. So it's you committed murder, 7 years fasting on bread and water, something like that. It's a very one-to-one kind of correspondence. This sin equals this penance. Now, if they were, this is oddly debated how much that was ever applied in reality that way. But in any case, that's how the books are kind of laid out. By the time you get to my period at the 1200s, it's very clear that they admired those kind of strict older penances, that kind of one-to-one, but it was made very clear to priests that at the end of the day, the penance that you give is determined by your own judgment. So you as a confessor are not bound to, if someone comes in and confesses murder, you're not bound to give them, those 7 or 10 years on bread and water. You can investigate through questioning. You can investigate the circumstances of the penitent's sins and see, if there might be situations that would, diminish their culpability. You can try to get a sense for how they would take the penance, whether it would lead to despair or actually be helpful, and all this. So you can take all that into consideration and determine, according to your own judgment, what penance should be given. And that's essentially what the practice that we have today as well. At the end of the day, that the priest on his own judgment can give you a penance. Now, the one difference is that in the Middle Ages, it was actually a law of the church that under normal circumstances, you could only confess to your parish priest. So, I mean, nowadays you can just go wherever you want. But for them, now there were a lot of exceptions to this and all this, but the ideal is that you would always confess to your parish priest, which meant you're confessing to someone who knows your history, and
Mm-hmm.
it might be more embarrassing, yes, but I mean, he's going to be able to make a better determination of what kind of penance is salutary for you.
Sure.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I think there is or at least I feel the penances used to be, let's say, harsher. Don't know if
Yeah.
by that time already they were still, like you're saying, it's
Yeah,
hard to tell what was actually
we
given out.
just we know very little about what was actually
Mm.
given out. We just have these
Yeah,
kind
yeah.
of general books, but yeah.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah. Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think that's maybe a good place to stop.
Good. All right. Yeah, I hear supper's a bit ready in the
Yeah,
background
yeah.
here, so
Oh,
it's
that's
good.
good timing. All right. Well, thanks a lot again.
Man, that was a lot of fun. It's great hearing from you and your story and
Yeah.
all that. So
Yeah,
yeah.
no, great. I think yeah, we'll see how it goes from here. I mean,
Yeah.
if you're interested, we could follow up. I'll see if I can sort of cobble something together with this. It
Sure.
was a very
Yeah, it'll
interesting
probably
conversation.
be, yeah, 100%. I'd love to follow up. It'll
Yeah.
be realistically for me. I'm going up to Canada soon, so in January, really.
Sure, sure. Yeah, yeah,
Before.
yeah. We'll
Mhm.
digest this a bit. I'll get through A
Yeah.
Secular Age by Charles Taylor. I'm reading that at the moment, so
Oh, good.
yeah,
I've not read it.
yeah.
It's one of those books I really
Yeah.
want to read. I hear about it all the time, and it's like,
Yeah, yeah, me too. But it starts
by
quite
the
well,
way,
though. It starts exactly about this process of disenchantment, and so
okay.
it's quite related. Yeah,
Well, I
yeah.
need to read it all the more. By the
Yeah.
way, if you like medieval books about literature about
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
Middle Ages, I don't know if you know. Do you know Sigrid Undset?
Nope.
So, uh, if you love
Yeah.
settings in the Middle Ages, Sigrid Undset, that's the author. She has a book
Okay.
called Kristen Lavransdatter. Now,
Okay.
it's
You might have
Kristen.
to email that to me. The
Yeah,
title.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But I would say of all the novels I've read that were set in the Middle Ages, I mean,
Oh, really? Okay.
she's just right on point. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Great. No, that sounds very
yeah.
interesting.
She's from the early 1900s, Catholic convert. I think she won the Nobel for that book or another book, but in any case,
Okay,
yeah.
definitely add it to the list. My ever-growing
Okay.
list of things to. But I'll
Yeah,
move it
that's
up.
right.
I'll move it up to the
That's
top.
right. All right. That
Awesome.
was a
Well,
pleasure.
Samuel, thanks a lot. Thanks for the time.
Yeah.
And have a nice evening.
You too.